For the Hunger Games. I was lying in bed late at night one night and I was channel surfing, and I found myself going in between reality television programs and footage of the Iraq War. And these images sort of began to meld together in my mind in a very unsettling way, and that's when it sort of struck me.
I believe we're having parallel experiences to what Suzanne Collins describes in the interview about the Hunger Games. But instead of flicking through channels when I was scrolling through our algorithms, we swipe up and we see atrocities committed by the government, and we swipe down and it's TikTok dances. It's almost like we're in a sort of simulacra, essentially. But if you're new here, hi, I'm Sharon, and this is Sharon Unfiltered, why I dissect media, fashion, politics, and everything in between. This video is inspired by a Substack piece that I wrote titled I'm Not Really Into Politics, in which I thought we had reached the peaks of political apathy, and I wrote that mid last year. But now I can see that I was incredibly incorrect, and things have taken like a terrible turn, essentially. And the light of recent events in terms of ICE raids in America, continuing injustices in places like Congo, Sudan, and Palestine, as well as the alarming crisis of what's going on in Greenland in relation to geopolitics and water. I feel there's an increasing need to discuss the influence of politics, policy, and state, but also just the increasing amount of political apathy and how detrimental that is, essentially. But a secondary inspiration I will say for this video is just the Vietnam War and my fixation around Vietnam. I've been watching a lot of documentaries and researching a lot into Vietnam over the last month or so, and it really brought me to when I first learned about Vietnam, and this was via the My Lai massacres, and this was in sixth form when I was studying sociology. And I think it's quite important to just research and understand more about the world, but also to have moments of enlightenment where you can draw parallels of what's happened in the past and how we can see that right now in our current media and the atrocities that are happening in the world. And Suzanne Collins speaks of Iraq being partially her inspiration for the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games is a great piece of fiction. I definitely think a lot of people should read it. There's a lot of parallels you can draw the Hunger Games and the adversities the characters go through and what essentially is happening right now systematically. But for me, I felt similarly when I was watching documentaries about Vietnam, and I could draw parallels between Vietnam and the war on terror or the invasions in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also parallels into what's happening right now, essentially, in how the humanitarian crisis that's happening in Palestine, for instance, and I can see parallels between that and from Vietnam and Palestine as well. So when someone says I'm not really into politics, it signals one of two things for me, essentially. You're either someone that is coming from a place of privilege, but you're also someone that is uninformed. You can be both of those things or either of those things, essentially. And as an adult, it's very risky to be any of those things as an adult, especially when you have the power to vote and you have access to a free internet. And there's just so much happening around you that when you choose to disengage from the world politically, you are choosing to basically be a bystander in state atrocities, essentially. And I also want to quote myself on Substack, in which I said, ignorance may be bliss, but it's a privilege that many cannot afford. To live unaffected by political changes and global injustice is a luxury. I think for me, especially coming from a migrant background, I've had quite a unique experience in which I've seen both the global north and the global south. And I also quote myself in this when I say, when you move from relying on petrol generator because government electricity is unreliable to having 24/7 electricity, you begin to grasp how deeply unfair the world is. You realize how much the global north benefits from the hardships endured by the global south. I've seen the extremes of both sides. I've been someone that's been decently comfortable in life in the global north, but I've also been decently impoverished as well in the global south. I think those experiences tend to push you to be more politically aware. And not just politically aware, but it brings about certain emotions out of you, emotions such as anger, for instance. And for quite a while, I was angry. And we see anger as this dismissive emotion that isn't as counterproductive or unproductive. But I think great things can come out of anger as well, or just simply caring. And anger for me, I realized I was so angry, but why was I angry? And I realized I was angry at a system that systematically oppressed me and people who looks like me. And very much understanding that really pushes you and fuels you to do more activism and realize that there's so much you can educate yourself about or educate others about and push for change. I also think though, in terms of anger at times is so often invalidated, especially for people of color, in terms of the type of prejudices and systematic crimes they go through. Like, we so often do address state crime in the way we address traditional crimes like murder. State crimes include murder, but on a larger scale, when we don't address that, state crimes, genocides, we barely really address that if we think about it. But I also want to bring in this quote by Bell Hooks in which she says, "The rage of the oppressed is never the same as the rage of the privileged." I think what I was saying earlier in terms of two things I do notice is when people aren't really politically engaged is that either uninformed or privileged. I think many of us speak from a place of privilege, operate from a place of privilege when we look at politics in a way that we can disengage because we politically are in the West and we are not forced daily to necessarily politically engage, but you're also privileged in the sense that sometimes policies don't necessarily affect you, so you feel like you don't have to engage with policies because I'm not being affected, so why do I need to care? Essentially, I think the political apathy that I am noticing at the moment is coming from a righteous amount of privilege and mostly geopolitical location that many of us are based in Western countries, European countries, countries in North America, countries north of the equator where you aren't going through political injustice on a daily basis. It's happening, but it's not essentially happening to you, so you don't care enough, essentially. And I do want to quote myself one final time, in which I said in the Substack piece, "Your ignorance will not save you. Sitting on the fence when it comes to human rights issues will not protect you. Just because you haven't lived through war or genocide doesn't mean it cannot happen to you." Which is a point I really want to reinforce. I think at times a political apathy does come from not just geopolitical privilege, but essentially believing it can't happen to me, but essentially because I'm white, for instance. But we're starting to see that a lot of the civil liberties that comes with living in the West and comes as essentials of democracy, we are coming to see that a lot of people are losing that essentially, especially with the recent ICE raids, particularly in America, in which not just people of color have been murdered, but also white people have been murdered, and now just a sudden outrage. But this has been a place of contention and complaint for a lot of people of color when it comes to immigration detention and how the police treats us. And finally when other people who are traditionally privileged are also being oppressed and murdered is when I think a lot of people are now starting to wake up and see the system benefits nobody. This blends into two topics I really want to discuss in this video. The first being the bystanderism of political apathy, and the second being the comfortability of watching people of color suffer. I very much agree with a lot of public discourse when we think about war and violence in media and how much of it is pushed on our screens and how much of it we see on a daily basis, and how essentially it has made us desensitized in the form of video games, in the form of news and media. A lot of violence and gore is being pushed on our screens. I do agree that that is a huge issue, but I also think that's a commonplace issue is the comfortability because of so much of that being pushed is people of color in those images and people of color being oppressed and being victims of violence. And because of so much of that being circulated and being commonplace in our media, we've become very comfortable with it. And something that really piqued my interest was when the war in Ukraine broke out, when Russia invaded Ukraine back in 2021. There was a lot of media discourse in shock and horror, not necessarily because war was happening, because war is not just this new thing, but essentially because the people being oppressed were white Europeans. And I remember one news clip, if I can find the clip, of the news forecaster being so shocked, and he was basically stating they were civilized people.
When we hear stories of border guards and others turning away black and brown people who are also trying to escape the war in Ukraine, because representation, of course, really influences whose lives some people view as worth saving.
This is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
On ne parle pas là de Syriens qui fuient.
I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed.
I think what's also horrific is the racialized hierarchy of life that we're seeing in some of the reporting of the war.
What's compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm loath to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East that are still in a big state of war. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that...
With all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
And it very much, I think what he said very much had racial undertones, because it very much implied that other people who have been systematically oppressed in wars in recent years, in Afghanistan and Iraq, in the global south, in Asia, are not civilized people. It's very much an implicator of racial superiority when it comes to intents of violence and who can experience violence, in a sense, and who can be victims of violence and who's expected to be seen on our screens. And I guess the average European viewer could, relate a lot more because the victims were white. That was very much something that piqued my interest and I did question. But as a psychology student, one of the things we really cover well is human behavior, and particularly with human behavior, just group behavior. And when we think of group behavior and in and out group behavior and belonging to a group, something that always comes up in an evolutionary way is this us versus them mindset. As a society, as a human race, we've been able to move between me versus us in sharing resources because we're likewise, we share the same skin tone or the same gender or from the same nationality, but we've barely been able, as a society, as a race, been able to move past us versus them. And we see it quite a bit in immigration, for instance, and how we treat refugees and migrants and the language used around it and how we call them aliens, even though we are of the same species. It's very interesting language around that. And I think a huge reason why we have so many issues politically right now is because of this focus on otherisms. And I recently read a book called Diversify, How We Should Challenge Inequality and Why We Should. And this book is by Jun Sapong. And the book explores otherisms and how they cause inequality, just the intersectionality of otherisms. And it's split into 4 parts: the other man, the other woman, the other body, and the other class. Each section basically intersectionally explores the issues that come with gender, ethnicity, class, essentially. And in this, she explores classism really well, and she explores the tragedy of the Grenfell Tower fire, which happened in the UK. So for those who don't know, the Grenfell Tower, it's a 24-story council building in London, and in 2017, a fire broke out in the early morning, and this fire was basically exacerbated or made worse due to the fact that the building exterior was covered in flammable cladding, and it resulted in the tragic death of 72 people. The inquiry that followed years after concluded that the disaster was completely avoidable.
The simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable, and those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by those who were responsible for ensuring the safety of the building.
Time it felt like the government didn't care, and it feels like right now the government still doesn't care because nearly 10 years after Grenfell, and there hasn't really been some form of justice delivered to the families and the victims who lost their lives in that fire. And I really wanted to focus on the Vietnam War, particularly because there's so many layers to it. So there's very much a lot of instances where people of color have been oppressed all over history. For instance, the slave trade, the atrocities that happened in the Congo in terms of mining and are still happening in the Congo, and British colonialism, which essentially happened everywhere. There's this quote, I think, that goes like, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." That's how big it essentially was at its height. But I think Vietnam is unique in the instance because it's the first time we see a lot of atrocities of war on camera and in real time. So war isn't foreign to us as a human race, essentially. I think it's only been like 30 years where we had no wars in human history. But It's the first time where war is documented in real time in color, and mothers, parents are basically seeing what their soldier sons are doing for work and what the atrocities of war truly looks like, and also just the impact of Western intervention in foreign countries. And I think it changed not just how the American psyche sees war, but also the Western psyche of what war is. And it's probably a huge reason why so many of us in today's society, modern society, are so against war. And Vietnam is impactful in so many ways. Like I said, there's definitely layers to it. We have one instance of government lies, so the state lying to get America even involved in the war in the first place. So let's think Nixon, Lyndon B. Johnson, the CIA, the Pentagon Papers, and we can literally draw parallels from that into the war on terror post 9/11 and the advances into Iraq and Afghanistan, and then the removal of them in the 2020s, for instance. But there's also other layers of sending young American troops, mostly people of color, into the war as well. And it's very much, if you research it quite a bit, there was very much privileges that white soldiers were able to get out of the drafts earlier on that soldiers of color couldn't get out of the drafts, for instance. So that was a form of discrimination there. But I think the additional layer of definitely sending just soldiers of color defending a country that didn't see them as equals, didn't see them as human, or didn't give them rights essentially, and defending that country in a war. And if we look into the Vietnam War, there's very much quite a good amount of civil rights activists who speak out against young men of color participating in the war, like Martin Luther King speaks out about it, but also Muhammad Ali, who said,
"Some poor hungry people in the mud for big powerful America, and shoot them for what? They never called me nigger. They never lynched me. They never put no dogs on me. They never robbed me of my nationality, raped and killed my mother and father. What, I'm going to shoot them for what? How am I going to shoot them?"
One of the haunting moments, I think, when I was researching the Vietnam War was how they did the draft in the later years, because obviously there was previously issues with discrimination with many men, soldiers of color, going into the Vietnam War disproportionately to how they reflected in the population, for instance. But and essentially in how they did the draft. So you know how like lottery tickets are like drawn like in balls. They basically rolled it, and if a ball was rolled, the ball had like a date, and if you were born that certain day, you had to be drafted into the Vietnam War. And sometimes I see that as quite dystopian in a sense, because that was actual reality. We can draw parallels from that, and even the Hunger Games when they're doing when Effie is rolling the ball and doing the draft for who's from each section is going to participate in the Hunger Games, for instance, as well. But the Vietnam War is also one of the first instances where we see a lot of public discourse against the war. Because prior to Vietnam War, I don't think there really was as much public discourse against war as there was in the Vietnam War. And that came through one form, which is pop culture. So in terms of music. So the really famous song, War, What Is It Good For? Absolutely Nothing, comes from the song War by Edwin Starr, which also was an anti-Vietnam War song as well. But also Ohio, which is, I think, one of the songs in defining the anti-war Vietnam movement by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young in response to the Kent State shootings, which happened in May 1970, in which college students were protesting on a college campus peacefully, and state troops basically shot down 4 college students and murdered them, essentially. And this is anti-war protest. Definitely think we can draw parallels between that and so many protests we've seen in recent histories in the 2000s, 2010s, and even 2020s against ICE, the Black Lives Matters protest. And I want to definitely highlight the power of collective protesting and collective organization and how much we can do collectively by opening our minds and speaking our truth, but also just protesting against the government, because freedom of speech is one of the fundamental pedestals of democracy. But I think also from the Kent State shootings, the divisive aspect of government or state power being enforced on innocent civilians, for instance. So the use of weapons against civilians. And I'm going to find the clip, but the use of basically weapons that are machinery that you would use in war against civilians, essentially.
I was looking at photos from federal operations in Minneapolis over the last week, and this one picture stood out. Tayana Gibson Brown is standing in the doorway, obviously in distress. She's wearing what appears to be scrubs. She has Crocs on and she's holding her phone in her hand. These agents are basically dressed for an imminent threat. There were pieces of equipment on these agents' weapons that seemed more at home on the battlefield, and here they were on the doorstep of a woman's house in Minneapolis.
But not just in the Trump administration in America, but we're also seeing the similar replications of that in the UK. But this has been happening since like 2011 in terms of hostile immigration policies, but it's also now enacting a form of violence force. So we're seeing the raids particularly of immigration rate basically of delivery drivers who are mostly people of color, who are mostly South Asian men around the East London area, which is where I'm from. And definitely is a race aspect to this as well. But essentially the use of state power on civilians, and also this use of panopticon-like behavior where we're constantly being monitored and being surveillance, and this test of new digital technology in a way to monitor us. It feels like slowly, even the people in the West, our civil liberties are being stripped from us. But I think one of the huge issues that allows many people to be bystanders or uninformed is essentially literacy. Literacy is a huge issue we're still facing, not just in America, but also in the UK and globally. So recently there was a clip of Kaisenart reading circulating and how he was struggling to read. But Kaisenart is just a small fraction of the issue we have with literacy. Many people cannot read and are also functionally illiterate. And by cannot read, I don't just mean like, oh, they can read A, B, C, D. I'm like, can you read and can you comprehend and understand what you have just read, essentially? So that is a really big issue when it comes to engaging politically. Just because politicians already use a lot of political jargon, they use language that makes it difficult for the average person to access or understand the political system or what essentially these new laws or legislation means. But if you can't comprehend or understand what's going on politically when these new laws and policies, first of all, how are you supposed to be angry about it? You don't know how it affects you. And because you don't know how it affects you, you don't realize how you're being systematically oppressed by these legislations and policies. Particularly though, when I discuss reading, a lot of people focus a lot on nonfiction, which I think is important. Nonfiction books very much explore theory and concepts politically, like Marxism, and there's a lot of nuance in nonfiction. But I also feel like people underestimate the power of fiction when it comes to reading. And fiction teaches us empathy. People overestimate that empathy is this innate behavior, which it can be and it is. But empathy is also a learned behavior through experiences such as reading. Like if we think of Hunger Games and Katniss Everdeen, many of us in the West will not have gone through the levels of oppression that these characters go through in the book, but we open the book and for the duration of that book we're put in the perspective of Katniss or whatever character is in the book, and we're forced to reckon with their perspective and go through their troubles and understanding. We comprehend and understand that. We close that book, and through the comprehension and understanding, we have empathy for other people who are systematically oppressed, like refugees, people of color, people who don't look like me. We have this level of empathy, but we can also draw parallels for the systems in the book, just like how this character has been oppressed. Certain people in my society are being oppressed. And fiction has the power to do that. Fiction has the power to bridge that empathy. And I want to read this particular quote by James Baldwin in which he says, "You think your pain and heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read." And there's this really beautiful interview that James Baldwin ends up doing, if I can find it, in which he describes suffering as our bridge.
We think that no one has ever suffered the way I've suffered. You know, my God. And then you realize, you read something, you hear something, and you realize that your suffering does not isolate you. That your suffering is your bridge. Mm-hmm. That many people have suffered before you. Many people are suffering around you, and always will. And all you can do is bring, hopefully, a little light into that suffering. Enough light so the person who is suffering can begin to comprehend his suffering and begin to live with it and begin to change it, to change his situation.
In particular, I want to take out the line where he says, suffering is our bridge, our suffering does not isolate us. I think for a lot of us, we think, not necessarily woe is me, but the way I've suffered is unique, and it is unique, but it's also collective. The way I've been oppressed is not just happening to me, it's happening to so many other people. And if I'm oppressed as a black woman and another woman is oppressed as another woman of color, but we're both being oppressed in the same system. We both have the same query against the same system. We have the same anger against the same system. That is our bridge to pushing for better systematically, for pushing for better policies, for pushing to not be ignored, for pushing to protest essentially. And it allows us to have a lot more empathy for the people who we share this society and who we share this world with. But I want to really end this video on a positive note, in the sense of there's so much power in conscious thinking. Marx addressed it centuries ago, but I'm addressing it now. There's so much power in conscious thinking and being awake and fighting against the system and critically thinking and critically engaging with information and just social and collective movements and discussing and discourse and reading and finding power in small spaces. And I think a lot of what I've said gives despair and that all is lost. But I feel like all is not lost. The system wants you to think that so you won't fight back. But there's so much power in collective organization. There's so much power in discourse and in thinking. But yeah. But if you liked this video, please share this video to someone who you think may also like it or may need it, and subscribe. But I also write on Substack, so if you want to see this type of information on text, that is on Substack, and I will provide the link in my description. But thank you for watching.